Now that we've sort of talked about the ideas underlying settlement in Canada, we're going to talk about that first piece, that sort of initial settlement of Europeans who stayed in Canada, right? We could talk about the Vikings and how they came to Canada before all the rest of the Europeans, but the Vikings came to Canada and then went home. So we're going to start with the French, at least here in Canada. So Samuel de Champlain starts Quebec City in 1608 under sort of orders of the French crown. And one of the things that you need to understand about the very early periods of colonization, sort of from that sort of 1610 period, is that there are very few people who really want to come here. And that's not necessarily because there's anything wrong with Canada, it's because the proposal is actually kind of terrifying. So if you think about what they're actually asking people to do in 1608 is to get on a very dangerous boat, because lots of people died crossing the Atlantic, to go to a place that nobody's mapped. Okay, so we don't know what resources are. They don't what resources are there. We don't know how big this space is. We have no idea whether or not this is going to be productive. We don't know what you can eat in the woods, what you can't, what animals are trying to kill you. No one really knows how to survive here. But we're going to ask you to get on a boat, essentially never see any of your family ever again because this is such an incredible voyage, and try to build a life in this crazy unknown place that no one can tell you very much about. And oh, by the way, there are some savages who already, quote, savages, right? I'm saying that in sort of the sort of idea there, that already live there, and we're not really sure how they feel about this. So that's not an attractive proposition to most people. The people that it is attractive to, okay, the people who are attracted to this idea in the first place, are people who exist very much at the margins of French society, right? These are people who sort of say, yeah, but that sounds like an adventure. And the people who think that that sounds like a good idea and an adventure are not exactly typical of most people, right? They probably don't follow established social rules particularly well. Or they're people who are really, really, really frustrated by the existing social order in France, by the order of people who are forcing them into sort of very narrow boxes, right? In France in the 1600s, basically, oh, your father was born a farmer on this particular plot of land. That's where you're going to be your whole life. And if you're not happy with that, there are very few ways out. So, that means that you have sort of a very particular, I don't want to say lawless, but very ready to experiment and very ready for social change group of people who initially lands in sort of New France. And these are people who sort of figure out very quickly that just because the French don't know what's going on in this land doesn't mean nobody does. They form relatively close relationships with the indigenous populations, including a lot of intermarriages, and they realize that that's a really symbiotic relationship in the sense that you can definitely get sort of the value of having contacts to trade furs and resources with the French government and sort of the French, the companies that are sort of established in Quebec City and eventually in Montreal, um, at the same time as benefiting from the knowledge of the land of the indigenous populations. And all you really had to let go of to do that was a social structure that wasn't serving you in France in the first place anyway, because most of the people who originally came to Canada felt really, really trapped by that. Okay, so that's one half of what's sort of going on in New France. The other half of that sort of very early colonial period is the Catholic Church is really, really well involved. So the Catholic Church is interested in coming to North America, but their interest is quite different from those people, right? We talked about how the French crown is really after that sort of economic gain that Columbus got for the Spanish crown in South America, and you have this group of the French people, sort of the population of France, who is really interested in coming to North America to essentially build something brand new, where they have a little bit more social mobility and the ability to build the lives that they want. And then you have the Catholic Church, whose goal in settling North America is actually really different, right? The Catholic Church's goal is essentially to save people's souls, right? So they're sending missionaries into indigenous communities, and their goal really is to ensure that more and more people follow the ways and the tenets of the Catholic Church. And I will sort of give you a very brief sort of moment here in that the Catholic Church in this context is not, in fact, a monolithic organization. The different religious orders have different ideas about how you go about saving souls. So we're not going to dig into a ton of religious history right now, but understand, for example, that the Franciscan monks, right, Franciscan missionaries have taken vows of poverty and have a really strong orientation to social justice. That's their idea about how missionaries serve God, right? They take a vow of poverty and they focus on social justice issues, okay? When you talk about other religious orders, Jesuits are a really great example, you wind up with different ideas about what's important and different ideas about how monks and religious people serve God. So Jesuits are really, really focused on evangelism. So they're really focused on ensuring that other people believe in God. But they're also really, really focused on education. And one of the reasons that I sort of mention that is that if you're in a community where that was established by Jesuits, you're going to have a school a lot faster than if the community was established by Franciscans. But if you're in a community that was established by Franciscans, you're going to have a religious sort of leadership, priests, pastors, whatever you want to sort of talk about, that live much closer to the sort of same standard of living as the rest of the community. And you're going to have a much better, I guess, sort of social safety net. And those two things sort of are important to understand. So when we talk about the Catholic Church, yes, there's this interest in saving souls, and that's not the same as the French Crown's interest in creating sort of that potential for prestige. But there's also variation within that sort of idea of the Catholic Church. Okay, so that's really early immigration from France, right? You basically have monks and missionaries and priests, and then the sort of adventurers who are really interested in that. And those adventurers eventually become what you probably know as voyageurs, the people who sort of took their canoes up the rivers of Canada into sort of even into the prairies to trade furs, to trade resources, to sort of interact with the indigenous population. Those voyageurs give rise to the Métis a little later on. But one of the things you need to understand about that is that most of the people who thought it was a good idea to get on a boat to go to an unknown land are men, okay? Partially because women's roles, like women are not encouraged to have this kind of ambition in the 1600s, and also because no one thought it was safe to send their daughters to such an unknown land because, who knows what might happen to their reputations. And eventually the French crown gets kind of sick of waiting for people to decide that moving to Canada is a good idea, partially because they're getting worried. And they're getting worried that they won't be able to hold this land. So Canada doesn't have brand new crops like chocolate or coffee. But Canada does have a couple of things that are really, 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 really important. And one of those things is massive fisheries. So we sort of hear briefly in the news now about the collapse of Atlantic fisheries. If you go back to the 1600s, the records of fishermen on the Atlantic coast, so through the St. Lawrence River and in the Maritimes, is essentially that when you look down from the boat into the water ran silver because there were so many cod. And that is a really, really rich fishery. It's really, really, really important. And the other thing that Canada has that's really important in that context is forests that are old enough that they have these very long, straight trees that you can cut to make ship masts. And that's very important at the time as well, economically. So there's becomes this desire to hold that land, right? To hold on to it. And the French crown sort of decides that one of the ways you have to do that is to address the gender balance, right? Because at a certain point they realize that they're not going to be able to import enough people to sort of hold that land and establish viable colonies. That one of the things that they need to do is have a number of people who were born in that new world. And the only way to do that is to essentially encourage more women to come. So one of the ways that they do that is by establishing something that is, well, the name for it in France is called Les Filles du Roi, so the daughters of the king, which is a lovely euphemistic term for the French crown sent people, like honest to goodness bureaucrats, to run through the brothels and poorhouses and orphanages of Paris and of the large French cities, and essentially find young women and say, so, if you get on this boat and go to Canada and get married, we'll pay your dowry. And that sounds like a crazy proposition, and it sounds like a version of state-sponsored prostitution, and I guess it kind of is. But that's a proposition that's a lot more palatable when you think about the fact that the young women who grew up in orphanages, the young women who grew up in poor houses, and the young women who are already working in brothels in Paris, those women don't really have places and respectable futures in the world, because the prevalence of the Catholic Church means that the only way you can be a respectable woman in that sort of space is to be married, or to have sort of a man associated with you, or you can join a convent. And the joining a convent is also sort of a lifetime of really hard work, and you don't get a lot of options. So there's a number of people for whom that's a really attractive proposition. And this is a kind of thing that no one would ever do now. But what this basically means is you have boats that land in the harbors in Quebec City, in New France, in Montreal, and you have these women who get off the boats, and you have a priest standing there, and you have the men of the community who come up and say, I want that one. And the priest will marry them on the docks, right? Especially early in this process, will marry them on the docks, and pay this dowry for this woman. And now you don't know this person, you don't know this land, but all of a sudden you're a wife, and you are expected to sort of create the society that you came from in France. And one of the things that means is that you're following the rules of the Catholic Church, which means lots of babies really quickly. We will talk about that in a little bit. But it also creates a really strong tension across the groups of people, because when you sort of move that many people, right? And there are also a number of men who are sort of saying, oh, well, if I can get a bride in New France, then I will also go and I will sort of establish a farm, and I will be able to sort of create essentially the life I wanted in France but couldn't get, rather than sort of building something new. And one of the things that does is that creates a strong tension in the Francophone community in early France. And that's sort of this tension between the voyageur population, who really doesn't want to repeat what was going on in France because they didn't like it, and this newer population, which gets referred to as the habitants. And if you're a hockey fan, you probably have an idea of where that name shows up again. But the habitants and voyageurs, the habitants is sort of attempting to essentially like recreate feudal France. They're trying to recreate the sort of norms of rural French life in Canada. Which means the sort of settled communities, which means the influence of the Catholic Church, which means the sort of emphasis on church life, on agricultural life, on having large families, and sort of reproducing this sort of very stable social order. And one of the things that you need to understand is that although both groups of people come from France, those are really different ideas about what society is and should be. And so for that sort of period from like the 1660s forward, a lot of what's going on in New France is trying to negotiate that tension, between the adventurers and the sort of the people who really want to just recreate feudal France, because they have different ideas about sort of how stable society should be, what the role of the French government should be, what the role of the Catholic Church should be. And sort of those tensions are really important to understand in the early days of understanding settlement in France, in what is now Quebec and was called New France.